Welcome to today's Advocata studio. I have the distinct pleasure of having Peter and Joel, who is in Sri Lanka but joining virtually. Maybe I can ask you, Peter, to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. So my name is Peter Breuer. I'm a mission chief for the Sri Lanka team of the International Monetary Fund.
Thank you. And Joel, what do you do?
Hi, and very nice to be here. My name is Joel Turkewitz. I'm the Deputy Division Chief of the Governance and Anti-Corruption Division of the Legal Department, and I was the Mission Chief for the Governance Diagnostic Report.
Well, welcome to today's episode. So, Peter, if I can first turn to you, Sri Lanka loves IMF. It's the 17th time we are with you. One has noticed that this time the program is a little bit different, that there is a focus on governance. How does governance fit into this program?
Thank you, Murtaza, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss these important issues relating to governance with you here and have an opportunity to speak to your audience. So the rules of how a society functions and how they're being adhered to are really fundamental to the functioning of an economy. Rules are important for economic, social, and political stability. When I came to Sri Lanka for the first time in 2022, at the height of the economic crisis, we heard from all corners concerns in this area that these rules may not all be the best they could be, and that there are concerns about adherence to the rules. So it became clear to us very quickly that for the economy to emerge out of the crisis and to be once again on stable and inclusive growth, on a path towards that growth, looking at governance and transparency was a very important part, a very important component. And in fact, we consider governance as one of the core pillars of the program, along with the many other things we have on fiscal stability, debt sustainability, financial stability, and so forth. So governance is a very important part. It's also important for the credibility of the economic program that the authorities have embarked on because of that skepticism that I mentioned. So dealing with it is very important. So it was clear to us that we needed to find out more about this, that we needed to look into this to see what could actually be done. How could these issues be incorporated into the program? And that's when we turned to our colleagues to see whether they could embark on what is known as a governance diagnostic to look into these issues in greater depth.
Okay, thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. If I can turn to you, Joel, and explain to us why the IMF conducts governance diagnostics.
So thanks for the question. And let me step back for a moment and just provide first a little bit of a sense of what is a diagnostic. As Peter has explained, it is an instrument that the IMF uses as a way of creating a holistic understanding of the nature of sort of governance challenges around some core state functions. So in 2018, the IMF adopted an enhanced framework for strengthening governance, which based upon sort of our work in thinking about governance and corruption and the consequences of these issues for overall economic reform and balance of payments, was in an effort to say, how can we address these issues in a more effective manner? And the core of the framework then was to say, when the IMF thinks about challenges in governance and corruption, we think about it across 6 core state functions, which are the core functions that a government needs to be able to do with effectiveness in order to have sound fiscal and monetary policies. And we identified those as the governance of the central bank, financial sector governance, fiscal governance, which includes both things like revenues, tax and customs, as well as budget issues, as well as procurement, issues around market regulation, as well as issues relating to anti-money laundering and the rule of law, which for the IMF is very much focused on contract enforcement and property rights as the foundation for effective economic activity. So we look across, we use this framework as a way of helping us to structure our analysis and structure our efforts to understand how these issues and how governance challenges affect particular jurisdictions. Now, in particular in Sri Lanka, what's most important to start is that the governance diagnostic was done at the request of the government. So the government requested the IMF to come and do a diagnostic as a contribution, an overall part of the reform program. And as the government, the leader from the government said in the kickoff meeting of the diagnostic, it was a sense that what he expressed was Sri Lanka has gone through many, many different cycles of reform. Where some reform happens, there is progress only to slip back. And so the challenge was how to create a sustainable progress of reform that would get to improved governance that was sustained and related to economic growth and social well-being. So the governance diagnostic was then initiated because governance issues were seen to be of critical importance in the overall economic program, and that addressing governance and corruption issues was essential for the economic reforms to be undertaken and effectively sustained. Let me stop there.
So, Joel, I understand that our president, in a speech that he made to the Ceylon Chamber, he said that the governance report is going to be translated to the local vernacular in Sinhala and Tamil. It's a very complicated document. Does every country release the results of the governance diagnostic?
No, I think, so first I agree. I think this was a very important statement by the president as a way of demonstrating transparency. And I think the fact that the Sri Lankan government both had the report published, as well as had it published on its own website, was an important demonstration of a commitment to transparency that's essential. And I think it's a very important effort, and it should be reinforced that Sri Lanka is the only country, is the first country in Asia to have asked for a governance diagnostic and to have published a governance diagnostic. In most instances, governance diagnostics are published. We've completed approximately 20 governance diagnostics since 2018. And in the majority of those, and in approximately 3/4 of those, the governance diagnostics have been published. But I think the government of Sri Lanka has been particularly forthcoming in its interest and not only willingness, but actually desire to have the report be accessible and to own the report in a very public fashion.
Okay. If I may have a follow-up question to you, Joel. I believe the diagnostic has identified 16 priority actions. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these actions and the prioritization of them?
Sure. So as you say, the governance diagnostic has identified 16 priority recommendations. There are also a larger set of complementary recommendations in the overall report. And the 16 recommendations span all of the 5 areas that we looked at in detail. So they span central bank governance, they span financial sector oversight, fiscal governance, anti-money laundering and rule of law issues, as well as core anti-corruption issues. And I would say that we can separate them into kind of 3 different buckets. One bucket is a set of recommendations were about immediately addressing leakages and having visible reforms that are visible to everyone. So, for example, in that bucket, there is a recommendation about adopting anti-corruption measures in tax and customs revenue because corruption is seen to undermine the collection of public revenues in those areas. There's a suggestion, a recommendation around the suspension of the strategic transaction law because that is also seen as a core area of leakage. And there was an emphasis on the appointment in a rule-based fashion of the commissioners of the Anti-Corruption Commission, CBOC, because that was seen as a very visible way of demonstrating a commitment to addressing impunity. There's a second bucket, which is about strengthening accountability and strengthening the accountability institutions that exist in Sri Lanka. That includes a recommendation about enhancing the ability of the National Audit Agency, to directly address corruption issues when officials are not responding and not fulfilling their functional responsibilities. A recommendation relating to asset declarations and the publication of asset declarations, especially for senior officials. A recommendation relating to transparency, about creating greater transparency about tax exemptions, procurement transactions, and a recommendation about beneficial ownership registries to increase the transparency to enable both the government as well as civil society to understand and to be able to monitor government actions that relate to accountability. And a final set of recommendations which are around structural change, things like a procurement law, or removal of the ability for ministers to change tax rules without parliamentary approval, the creation and transparency around land titling, and the strengthening of the Judicial Service Commission, and finally, and critically important, a recommendation around implementing the state ownership policy and addressing problems and issues around state ownership. So the recommendations come in three sort of different varieties, and together they try to form a coherent whole.
Very comprehensive, Joel. And as a civil society actor, I thank you and your team for having done such a comprehensive report. It's very rich, it's very informative, and I hope at least 1,000 people in my country read it because we can have a much more richer conversation. So if I can turn to you, Peter, can you explain how this governance diagnostic is linked to the current program and what the next steps would be?
Yeah, so for us, this governance diagnostic was very important, and collaborating closely with Joel and his team was very important to understand these recommendations and think about what are the priorities, how can we incorporate this into the economic program that the authorities commit themselves to. So first, the publication of the governance diagnostic was from early on of the program a commitment that the authorities had made, and it was published on time in September 2023. Secondly, the implementation, having an action plan of the implementation of the recommendations is a key commitment. This is something that is coming up in the program. So thinking about all these recommendations that were made, what can be done about them, how can they be implemented. Then we had other elements in the program that again was discussed with the authorities and mutually agreed. So the new anti-corruption legislation was an important part for that. Other aspects are so the kind of investigation of corruption and bribery is very important. So the how the commission that is created for that does that is very important. So it's not only the rules, it's also how they're being enforced, and the people doing that are very important. And hence we paid a lot of attention to how the commissioners of this new anti-corruption commission are being selected, and there was a commitment relating to that. Other aspects are following up on what Joel said in the area of transparency. in Sri Lanka, there are a lot of tax exemptions in a country that is suffering from very low tax take. So getting a clear picture of how much revenue is actually missing from this country that's suffering from insufficient revenues to support the expenditures that it has was important. So there's a commitment to publish tax exemptions, firms that benefit from tax exemptions, as well as transparency around public procurement contracts above a certain size is an important commitment. Other commitments relate to asset recovery of stolen funds. That is what we call benchmark coming up, as well as the functioning, the governance of public banks, ensuring that these are managed in a capable and efficient manner is a very important commitment, because public banks are so important in the financial system in Sri Lanka and play this key role in intermediating financial flows. And then lastly, asset declarations, as Joel had recommended, of senior officials is something that we considered as being important. So these are some of the specific commitments that the authorities have made in what we call structural benchmarks. But I should point out that governance plays a role in many other aspects of the program. It permeates the program. So in the fiscal area, there are reforms relating to public financial management. There's the establishment of the public debt management unit. There are fiscal rules and transparency. Then we have in the sort of banking financial area, aspects of the Central Bank Act relate to governance and transparency, and similarly, amendments in the Banking Act relate to governance and transparency. And finally, also to point out in other areas, the reforms around the social safety net and of state-owned enterprises also have elements pertaining to governance and transparency. So it's all around very important.
So we are undergoing a very deep economic crisis. I think almost 50% of the population, the bottom 50% of the population are really suffering. And there is a public perception that this is a governance crisis. All the focus is on corruption, and corruption is a subset of governance. Can you explain how this governance diagnostic and the findings are helping in the program, the recovery of the economy? How is it linked?
So, as I said at the outset, governance, transparency are key to the functioning of society and of an economy. It's everywhere. How we behave has implications for the welfare of everyone in this economy. So just to give you an example, on the fiscal side, the more corruption can be eliminated, the more the state can raise its revenue from its regular tax rates, the less has to be asked of everybody. It means the burden on everybody can be reduced if corruption can be eliminated, right? The corruption of a few is a price that's paid by everybody else. Reducing the burden on everybody else by eliminating corruption is a very important part. In the financial area, if banks can function more efficiently, if they can intermediate financial flows more efficiently, that will bring down the cost of capital. This will bring down the cost of intermediating these flows. And that will help with the allocation of capital. That will contribute to restarting growth and putting Sri Lanka on a trajectory of stable and inclusive growth. And in the social area, it's so important that the allocations that are being made to those who really need the support of society, that they get what is being allocated to them, and that this money isn't lost or misallocated to those who don't really need it. So those are just sort of a few examples of how eliminating corruption is really important.
In fact, if I was to add a personal flavor to it, I have seen, especially in public procurement, the corruption is not only what they take, but they misallocate resources. So they go generally, they award the projects to perhaps the most expensive one because the amount of money that is leaked out is higher, and it's not necessarily the most optimal option. And that's where the biggest damage is done rather than what has been leaked out. So Joel, based on the governance diagnostic, what are the priority areas?
Thanks. And I just want to support your last statements about procurement, which I think filters in and feeds into my response. I think what we understand about corruption and procurement, when procurement works effectively, what happens is the state purchasing promotes competition, promotes private sector development, and allows for new entrants to succeed through more efficiency and greater effectiveness. When procurement happens through corrupt mechanisms, all of those benefits get lost. And so when we think about, well, what's the cost of corruption to Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's economic development, it's a small amount that gets lost through bribery. And it's even actually a small amount, or it's a larger amount, but of what gets lost in terms of efficiency. What gets lost is a lack of competition, a lack of the ability for new firms to come into the economy. And those are the places where if we address corruption effectively and find ways to have both the public sector work more effectively and for accountability institutions to be more effective, that the potential for supporting economic development is vast and enormous. So in that same vein, what I'd like to focus on is I think the diagnostic suggests that there are first a set of core channels for corruption, where corruption has a fundamental impact upon economic development. And it's important to address those areas. And in particular, what the diagnostic focuses on is a particular areas around state ownership, and both state-owned and state-owned companies, around public procurement, around the financial sector, and around land, and activities around land. It also focuses on existing and current weaknesses in accountability institutions, including the current weaknesses and vulnerabilities relating to the CBOC, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Financial Intelligence Unit, the Audit Agency, as well as the Right to Information Commission. So what we're trying to do on the recommendations is, and I think the priorities lie in both doing things that disrupt the corruption channels that exist, at the same time strengthening the accountability structures that exist in Sri Lanka and can be strengthened, and if they are effectively strengthened, can be truly a powerful force for changing the governance dynamics and improving effectiveness. So I think what you see in how we prioritize and the short-term priorities are exactly along those two areas, reducing the obvious sort of ways that corruption happens along these key areas, as well as strengthening the accountability structures. I do want to say that I think Sri Lanka has the potential for benefiting from a strong institutional framework. So the institutions exist in Sri Lanka. And I think also a very long and strong tradition of civil society engagement and oversight with an active media is a fundamental strength of Sri Lanka that I think it's critical to both recognize and to activate and to utilize as much as possible in trying to drive reforms to happen. Because what we found historically is that oftentimes the reforms proceed quickest in those places where the ability for the civil society and for outsiders to understand and monitor performance and push for change is the places where perhaps there's the greatest possibility for change to happen in the short term.
If I can come in here, Joel, with my own personal experience, in many jurisdictions, doing business with the government is not very profitable. But in Sri Lanka, it is the most profitable segment of the market because it's either being selling to the government above market price or buying something from the government below market price. And what contributes to this nexus is that our political system, especially the electoral system, the way it's organized, you need a lot of money to be in politics because the electorates are very large, they're district based. So this creates a very toxic mix between elected representatives and the government system. So outside your remit, we civil society have to also lobby to change the electoral system so that you don't need so much of money to be in politics.
Can I add something?
Yes.
I think it's very important to recognize that the government is the largest purchaser in the country. It's the largest landowner in the country. Its economic consequences and impact are huge. And getting to greater efficiency and effectiveness in its ownership mechanisms, in the way land is addressed and dealt with, and public procurement, that state contracting, is fundamental to getting to a more competitive and growing society. And I think your point about the political, as you say, this is kind of outside the remit of the IMF, but I think we recognize that this is also an important dimension.
And if I can just add to that, that what Joel just said and you said can be felt by the people right away. If they have to pay less taxes, if utility prices are lower, if generally prices for goods and services are lower because the economy is functioning more efficiently, is something that is felt immediately. So pursuing that goal, I think, is a very important objective.
And I can vouch for that, Peter, because having observed how government has functioned for 30 years, there's ample opportunity to lower costs. That system is gamed. The contracts are basically written in a way to prefer a single bidder. So there's a lot of reform that needs to be done. Now, the 17th program is revenue-based consolidation. So the focus is on taxes. There was a time 20 years ago or more where our tax to GDP was close to 20%, and our low point, it was even below 8%. And I believe the program targets about 14% at the end of the program. So you are under the program, they are widening the tax base, especially the VAT from 1st January, which is the right thing to do because VAT is the least distortionary tax. And by exempting certain segments, you are creating a distortion in relative prices, which is slowly being fixed. But then there are others who say that, okay, the VAT is felt by the poorest, yes. But there are others right at the top of the stack because the wealth distribution in Sri Lanka, like many other countries, is highly concentrated amongst the top 1%. That there are these highly generous tax exemptions that are being given through the strategic development project. There has been recently an announcement in the media about a logistics facility in the Colombo port, which is a highly established port, and I don't see the reason why a tax concession of 15 or 16 years is warranted. And then we have this real estate development called the Port City, where they have been given special powers to give tax holidays as long as 40 years. Now, this doesn't seem to be fair. I mean, projects that don't require tax exemptions because the private returns are far in excess of their cost of capital. And then the poor people basically who don't have a lot of say through their consumption, not necessarily direct taxation because they are below the threshold, are having to have very regressive taxes. How can this be fair?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Murtaza, that these tax exemptions in a country where tax collection is so low are indeed a concern because it essentially means that the burden on the rest of the population is larger in order to make up the difference to expenditures, because you still have the government providing essential services that need to be financed one way or the other. And tax exemptions to one group means the other groups have to pay a higher tax burden in order to be able to finance these expenditures. Because that didn't quite happen, that's how we landed in the crisis. And so now we are trying to find ways to undo this, to restore confidence and to restore confidence of lenders who will once again lend to the government to cover that gap. But specifically to your question, we were concerned about these exemptions. And so the authorities have now committed under the program to have more transparency, to publish a list of firms that benefit from tax exemptions under these various schemes that exist, so that it's at least clear who benefits from it, and there's meant to be an estimate of what is the value of these exemptions, so that there's a better view of how much revenue is actually missing. So I think that will be very important. And then even more important than that, the government has committed to not grant any more exemptions. So I think that is also very important going forward, that as the government is trying to collect more revenue with one hand, that it doesn't then offer more tax exemptions with the other hand.
But in the report itself, you go on to say that there are 3 pieces of legislation: the strategic projects, the port city law, and some kind of pharmaceutical industrial zone that have been given authority to provide tax concessions. And we have recently seen some announcements about projects in the port city, about this logistics facility in the port, which have been announced after the commencement of the 17th program. Have you questioned them of why they are going ahead while they have signed off or not to do it?
Yes, we have brought this up, and our understanding is that these are proposals that have been tabled but that are not being implemented.
Okay, right. If I can move over to you, another part of fiscal management is the public financial management, Joel. And Sri Lanka has a procurement guideline, but we don't have a procurement law. Why do we need a law?
So thanks. I think there are 2 answers to this question. I mean, first, if you look at the procurement guidelines that exist and currently function in Sri Lanka, what you find is there is an excessive amount of authority that's vested at the cabinet level in making decisions about large procurement. What you want to try to do, especially in large procurement, is have as great an input from the technical aspects of on procurement. So the greatest possible ability to evaluate the technical specifications of a bid and limit the political involvement of others, because that's a way of creating decisions that will not be particularly effective and efficient. Almost all countries, and if you look through the international experience, have public procurement laws because they create a type of consistency in the legal framework around public procurement, which is, as we've talked about just previously, a vital element both in how the government spends money, but also how the economy functions. So public procurement laws create a level of regularity and consistency in the legal basis for procurement. They also establish clarity in how procurement processes are supposed to be done, as well as clarity in how procurement processes are supposed to be monitored and overseen, and establish mechanisms to ensure that the rules are actually followed effectively. I think there have been a number of work and evaluations about Sri Lankan procurement, which has identified a range of issues around its effectiveness, and one of them being just a lack of clarity or a lack of the ability to rely upon the legal basis that currently exists, because it's not a law, because it exists as a guideline that prevents the type of assurances that you would want to have. And things like moving to an e-procurement system and moving towards more effectiveness and use of IT systems, those types of investments in your public procurement system, which are essential, are not happening in Sri Lanka right now at the speed and pace that's essential in order to support reform. And the adoption of a public procurement law that meets international standards, that is supported and is in accordance with the type of advice that's been provided by the World Bank, is an essential step in demonstrating Sri Lanka's commitment to a stronger legal basis and a stronger public procurement system.
Okay, that was quite comprehensive, Joel. If I may have another question, in your report, Annexure 2 has a detailed case for an independent public prosecutor. But in the body of the report, you say that this is not an immediate priority. There seems to be a lot of feeling across civil society that that should have been a priority. Because can you explain to us why you need an independent prosecutor and why the existing prosecutorial arrangement through the Attorney General's department is suboptimal?
Sure, and thanks, and we appreciate that that there are people who would preferred us to be more forthright in making a recommendation about the creation of an independent public prosecutor. We thought it was important to have that discussion in the governance diagnostic because we think it's an important question for Sri Lanka going forward. Is the existing arrangements around public prosecution, and particularly public prosecution of corruption offenses, is this actually yielding the results that Sri Lankans want and expect from their government? And I think that's an open question. And what we see internationally is that certain jurisdictions have moved to an independent public prosecutor and other jurisdictions haven't. And there is no one model right now that dominates where you can say this is what countries should move to. We think it is an important question to consider. Ultimately, when we were thinking about this in terms of priorities and in terms of where we wanted to focus, we thought the critical first step is the adoption of the anti-corruption law and the creation of an effective anti-corruption agency, CBOC. And CBOC, it's important to recognize, has independent investigative responsibilities as well as independent prosecutorial authority. And we thought that that it was critical to have CBOC up and running as an independent entity. And after some time, I think it will be more apparent whether the existing legal framework and organizational arrangements around the investigation and prosecution of corruption is yielding the results that Sri Lankans want. If it ends up that CBOC is not able to effectively prosecute, or that there are still efforts and still beliefs that a different arrangement would yield better results, I think it is at that point where moving towards a different arrangement might make sense. But it is always the case that creating new agencies and new institutions is a very long process. It takes significant resources to do that, and oftentimes the effectiveness of new institutions is not dramatically different from the effectiveness of older institutions. So we did not think that as a priority, creation of an independent prosecutorial authority was the priority at this moment in time in Sri Lanka. But we do think it's an important question to remain open and for people to be considering what is the right model for Sri Lanka as it goes forward.
Okay. Finally, Peter, if I can turn to you, 2 years ago, we had a protest movement in Sri Lanka called Aragale, which is the struggle. And it was a basically youth-led movement outside the Shangri-La Hotel. One of the key requests was we want system change. Of course, they were unable to explain. They intuitively knew what it meant, but they wouldn't have specifics of what exactly had to be done. I believe the IMF governance diagnostic is part of what can be done for system change. So what can civil society, the private sector, ordinary citizens and government do to implement what is in the report?
So if I had to answer your question in one sentence, I would say, if you see something, say something. I think it is very important for each individual and for society as a whole to work together to fight against corruption, fight against bribery, increase transparency for the very benefits we discussed, to lower the burden on every individual. So at the government level, it's very important that government is organized in such a way that there be severe punishment for any sort of act of corruption or bribery, and that this be actually prosecuted and pursued. Similarly, the private sector needs to go after people who engage in such practices that could involve government officials. And for CSOs and the media, they play a very important role in holding the government to account. So there needs to be an enabling environment that allows them to play their role, to hold the government to account, and that they have that civic space to operate in that. So I think in this way, all elements of society can work together in order to improve the functioning of society and actually benefit from the economic gains that are to be reaped by that.
Mm-hmm. So over to you, Joel. I mean, you have probably seen this in many other countries. How is the best way forward in implementing the recommendations?
Thanks for the question. And I think one of the core learnings around governance is always that each country and each society has to find its own way to good governance. It's a phrase that we use, but indeed there's not a model to emulate. But indeed it's a way of having decisions and the use of power and authority done in a way that's effective in a society and meets societal standards. So I think it's important to understand that there is variation that's important, and that at the same time countries can learn from each other. I think one of the critical things that we've learned is the importance of leadership. Leadership, not just leadership from government and from the top of government as an essential element, but also leadership from all of the other elements of society that need to come together. So I think leadership in the private sector of demanding a rule-based governance and demanding standards of itself is essential. I think leadership of civil society and leadership by media are also essential elements of having change happen. I think the second thing I just want to emphasize is one of the things we've consistently seen is whenever you have reform success, whenever you start, and I think Sri Lanka has already demonstrated and taken important steps along the reform trajectory, what we understand is that whenever there is reform success, there is a pushback against that. As rents and as the proceeds and the people who benefit from the status quo start challenged, there will be a counter effort in order to move things back again to how they've been. And so I think one of the critical things is to understand and appreciate that it is not a linear progress of reform, that's not how governance reform happens. It is that you will make progress through leadership and through commitment to achieving specific objectives, but that you should expect that there will then be efforts to try and roll back those reforms and to, in some ways, be prepared. And being prepared means having groups of people as allies together so that no one group can succeed if they're separate. Government by itself cannot enforce governance reforms if it's not being supported by the private sector as well as civil society. Just as government by itself is unlikely to do all of the things that are important and needed without the pressure from the private sector and civil society. So I think these things are really important to recognize. And I guess the last and final thing in line with this is that what I appreciate is that there's no one reform that's going to succeed and change the governance situation in Sri Lanka. It is a collection of reforms that together may change the incentives and may change the mechanisms by which the government works and by which accountability happens. And so it's critical to make sure that we don't expect dramatic, transformative change by a single act. So the creation of CBOC or the having CBOC commissioners, or the creation of an asset declaration system. These are important components of a different governance paradigm and a different governance environment. But in and of themselves will not change governance in Sri Lanka. It is a collection of things that happen, and the integration of these across the reform element that are going to drive success. And I think Sri Lanka has a tremendous opportunity because of the strength of each of the different dimensions of the Sri Lankan society that exist that can drive reform progress in a sustained fashion.
You know, when you were speaking, Joel, it reminded me of something that I read about the iron law of oligarchy. That just because you throw one set of people out, you have to be careful that another set of people don't come and exploit the same system. And that's why we need a change to the system so that, you know, we cannot be exploited like what happened to us in the past. Also, Peter, that since this is a fiscal-based program, it reminds me of Professor Mick Moore, who said that societies in which its people pay taxes enjoy more governance. And it is so true because people then feel that it's coming out of the... So just as you said that, you know, say something. Now you have a lot of people who are seething with anger and they will say something. So from my personal point of view, I thank the IMF to have come to Sri Lanka's assistance at this juncture. It was the only game in town. It is the 17th time, and let's hope it's the last time.
We do everything we can with that objective in mind. And thanks so much for giving us the opportunity to speak about this very important aspect of the economic program here in Sri Lanka. Yeah.
So thank you once again, Peter and Joel. And maybe we meet again in better times.
I'm sure we will.